Take each game and its merits there.
Hello and you're very welcome to our latest episode of Each Game on Its Merits. Myself, Eibhilin O'Reardon.
I'm Jerry Farrell.
And we're today discussing the 1931 December 13th game in Dublin between Ireland, the FAI Ireland team, and Spain. And Jerry, we get our asses handed to us. We are defeated comprehensively 5-0. It's not even like the 1993 infamous game against Spain when we got hammered 3-1. This is a 5-0 tonking, as you might say. So it's December 1931, probably a chilly out time in Dublin. You wouldn't imagine that the Spanish team are really up for it. There's great footage actually of on Pathé News of not of any of the goals, but of what happened that day.
Yeah, the dignitaries and the teams lining out. Google Pathé News and look, search Daily Mount or Ireland into their 1931. And you'll find some great stuff there.
Spain's fine victory, giving a brilliant display of clever football. Spain easily defeat the IFS, which is the Irish Free State, at Dalymount. And the teams are being met here by, you have identified the individual as being...
James McNeill.
James McNeill. So he's the brother of Owen McNeill, who was the former Irish Volunteers leader,
man who tried to countermand the orders for the Easter Rising and so on.
And he was the Governor General of the Irish Free State. And in those days, pre the installation or the creation of the role of the President in 1938, we had pretty much some low-profile individuals whose job it was to be the representative of the Crown in Dublin, but they weren't asked to do much, and they were deliberately not doing very much. But anyway, he's meeting the teams here, including a chap who we can't identify with a pretty fetching headband from the Spanish side. Anyway, they run out 5-0 winners, and I will go to the team and I'll give the little account of the game. So the team, Tom Ferguson clearly has a bit of a stinker. Our friends of the pod from Cardiff.
Well, we'll discuss this later because there's conflicting views on how well Ferguson does.
Alright, well you let in 5 goals, but let's come back to that. Right, George Lennox from Shells. So there's 2 debutants, so it's actually quite a settled side, right? Larry Doyle from Dolphin, William Glenn from Shamrock Rovers, Harry Shatton from Dumbarton. He's now in Dumbarton. And
formerly of Shelburne. He's moved around a bit. He's also been capped by the IFA on a number of occasions as well.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to the old tension with the IFA, which begins to bubble over. He's seen here in this film actually introducing the players there to the dignitaries. McLaughlin from Cork, John Joe Flood from Rovers, Patsy Gallagher.
Apparently he hated being called Patsy. He liked Paddy better. But yes, Patrick Gallagher, who we've mentioned actually, I think at our first episode.
Yeah, because
the
his
mighty
grandson
atom
is Kevin Gallagher, who played for Dundee United Blackburn Rovers in Scotland in the 90s. A genius, a internationally recognised and renowned player, but at this point,
winding down his career. We kind of suggest, now in fairness, the FAI have tried to call him up on a number of occasions. He's not been released by his club. Right. He's most associated with Celtic. He's won 7 league titles for Scottish FA Cups for Celtic, including I want to mention his the 1925 Scottish Cup final goal, the Gallagher final, where he dribbles the ball around basically an entire defence and then kind of somersaults with the ball over the line in one of the most astonishing astonishing goals never captured on film, but was talked about by a generation of Glasgow Celtic fans for many years. But at this stage he's playing for Falkirk and kind of winding down his career.
He's listed as Glasgow Celtic here, but probably is
He's definitely Falkirk, and his age is up for debate because a lot of people fudge their age again. Some places list him as 37, but he's probably more likely 40.
But
so he's probably our oldest ever debutant.
Davy Babby Byrne, who also lines out that day, as long as Fred Horlicker and Peter Kavanagh from Glasgow Celtic. David Babby Byrne does a bit of a dumpy on him and says, not a great player.
No, and I think it's fair to say Paddy Gallagher was a great player, but he's past it. And he basically said he's there for name recognition. He's there because he's a big draw. He gets bums on seats. And when we went back to 1924, so 7 years earlier, when Patsy was still in his prime, he's mentioned a lot. He's the big draw when Glasgow Celtic come to play that Free State selection.
Which is the one before the 1924 Olympics.
The fundraiser for the Olympics, exactly.
Okay, so we have not played a game in Damon Park since in 2.5 years.
Yeah, so we play Belgium in April 29. We have a great win, 4-0. And let's just put it in context here. we're a bit cocky because we've drawn 1-1 in a great result in Barcelona. So we've in front of 100,000 passionate Spanish fans. Spain are a great side. The view is at the time they're coming to Dublin on the back of an absolute hiding in Highbury against England. So they're the first continental side to beat England. They beat England 4-3 in 1929. The tables have turned by 1931. They play in Highbury. It's December. It's a wet, boggy pitch, and they get hammered 7-1. Ricardo Zamora, who we mentioned in the previous episode, who's getting chipped by Paddy Moore.
Paddy Moore doesn't play this game.
Paddy Moore's injured, unfortunately. So it's kind of centre forward. Berth goes to David Byrne, Babby Byrne. So he gets absolutely, I think there's about 10 or 12 shots on goal. He concedes 7. He blames the fact that he's wearing new gloves. Zamora has an absolute stinker, and he's replaced by Gregorio Blasco of Atletico Bilbao. And we're a bit cocky. We go, well, they've been hammered by England 7-1, and we drew with them away from home, so we might nick a result. So the press before the game are going, we'll at least get a draw, and we might sneak a win.
Right.
How wrong they are.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Paddy Gallagher is a luxury we cannot really afford. Expecting to beat the Spanish in Dublin with a 40-year-old. Speaking as a 47-year-old. Seems like a pretty poor strategy. Anyway, the games is described as thus: the Irish had no answer to Spain's speedy passing game and fell behind to an early goal by Regurio, Luis
Regurio, who is playing for Real Madrid at this stage. And he's an important player. We'll talk about him a little bit later.
Van Trola's cross was fisted away by Farquharson. Farquharson likes the old fists. He likes to fist the ball. But it fell to your pal again's feet, and he scored. Ireland's best spell followed this goal, looking for an equaliser. Harlequin struck the crossbar with a shot, while a header by Babby Byrne seemed to cross the goal line. Oh, where's VAR? VAR?
The referee is John Langenus, who we've mentioned before, the Belgian man who refereed the 1928 FAI Cup final, and probably more importantly the 1930 World Cup final.
Possibly, but I mean,
Bohs didn't win. Bohs won them. We won't let.
There's a massive controversy in the 1938 World Cup final over the ball that was going to be used. Anyway, and then Blasco scored at the second attempt. A fine Spanish move involving half the team here that I won't pronounce, ended with Rogerio scoring with a right-footed drive. Arocha added a third. So
he's the guy who scored against us in Barcelona.
He's the guy,
and we've mentioned he gets killed a few years later during the Spanish Civil War.
But he's the Paddy Moore of his day. Following a dribble by Samitier 5 minutes before the break, Spanish pressure continued in the second half, and Arocha scored the fourth when he headed in Van Trola's cross. Van Trola, who wore a beret. That's stylish now. You can imagine the Daily Mail crowd going, look at your man, isn't that so exotic?
Now we're speculating because we were looking at the Pathé newsreel footage, and there isn't a guy wearing a beret, but there is a guy with a kind of a headband handkerchief.
And if you look at this guy in the footage, he tries to cross with his right foot, it's blocked, and he is equally adept at crossing with his left.
Yeah, and if you read some of the description in the newspapers, we can't keep up with the pace of not only just the physical pace of the Spaniards running at us, but the pace of their passing. That we're criticised for every time we get the ball, we have to stop and trap it and take a touch. Right. Whereas the Spaniards are passing and moving. They're what's called the flick pass, that they're doing these little tricks and flicks. And
our entire team is playing in Scotland and Ireland.
Yeah, and Wales.
So
this is we were just talking about this before the episode.
The beret raced away, cut inside, scored the fifth goal from close range. None of the footage actually shows any of the goals.
Yeah.
But it's quite clear that Spain had most of the ball. And none of the interesting enough, numbers are not on the back of the jerseys either. That doesn't come in till
1933, the FA Cup final. Man City and Everton wear numbers in the first kind of very high profile game.
Right, so they wouldn't have had numbers. There wouldn't have been numbered jerseys.
Yeah, they become common by the end of the 30s. Most teams are wearing a standard 1 to 11. 1 is your goalkeeper. You were playing this 2-3-5 formation, so your full-backs are number 2 and 3, and then your half-backs, your midfielder are 4, 5, 6. Your left winger is 11. Your right winger is a 7. Your inside left is a 10, your inside right is an 8, and your centre forward is a 9. And as it should be.
What about your false 9?
Yes, indeed. Well, we'll come on to false 9s, but actually sooner than you think.
No.
Oh, yeah.
No.
There were false 9s in the 30s.
No.
Don't believe the...
No.
Yeah, don't believe the rumours.
No. I'm not having that. Not having false 9s.
Fake news.
So... The Dublin crowd, as you say, began to drift away towards the end because they were witnessing a bit of a massacre. But it was a very, very, very one-sided game. Goals scored in the 6th minute, the 34th, the 40th, so it's 3-0 at half-time, and then 10 minutes before the end in the 80th and 88th minute. But you're saying, you're giving me a but there.
But it's still a record attendance. Now,
35,
depending...
35 tested.
Yeah, so there's different estimates between 30 and 37. 35 sounds about right. The... Gates money is well over £2,000, which is a huge win for the FAI.
Still struggling FAI.
So this is a record crowd in Dalymount. So Dalymount has Archibald Leach has been working on Dalymount. He's upgraded the main stand and the terracing at the shopping centre end, or the tramway end as it would have been known then. There was no shopping centre there. So this is a record attendance for a newly enlarged Dalymount,
which at that time would have been one of the best stadiums in these islands.
It would have been comparable with like a top flight English ground. It would be up there with.
So when John Giles said he started playing or going to Dalymount or playing in Dalymount, it was comparable with the best grounds in England.
This was a modern stadium, and the descriptions are of the crowd are packed out Dalymount an hour before the game. You can't move. It's absolutely packed. And here's the crucial thing.
What day of the week is it?
When they get hammered. So it's a Sunday. Here's the thing. We should talk about the Sunday as well. Here's the thing. They play in England, and it's a boggy pitch in Highbury, and Spain are routed. But when they come to Dublin, it's been a couple of days later. It hasn't been raining here. It's a dry pitch, and they can move the ball quickly. They're not getting bogged down. And even in the previous game, we've mentioned that we started doing we hold on in the second half because there's a bit of rain and the pitch gets a little bit boggier, which doesn't suit the Spanish style of play. On a dry pitch, they're able to do this quick passing and absolutely make a show of us. And we think, like a match on Sunday, that's not so weird.
So you know what's irritating about this is that I'm still getting over recent Ireland defeats,
and now we're getting traumatised by stuff from 80 years ago.
Now I have to learn about these other defeats. So I mean, in my head, the only kind of trauma I have about us versus Spain is '93.
The 2002 World Cup, the
2002 World Cup, the 2-0 in '88 when half the team was injured.
We got destroyed in Gdansk that time.
That was horrendous. I was there.
They were very good. What amazing team.
But that's enough.
Yeah, it's a lot.
I can still think to the fact that we gave them a good shot in 2002. We beat them in Leinster Road in '89. And that's enough for me. But now I have to just open new wounds and say this is what happened in 1931.
This is the Spanish Inquisition. Yeah. We don't expect it.
I don't need this in my life. Anyway, but now.
And Sunday kind of screws us over because we're missing a few of our key players. Mick O'Brien, who we've mentioned, centre half, who's playing in England.
Yes.
He's playing for Walsall, I think, at the time.
I don't see Jimmy Dunn on this team.
And Jimmy Dunn isn't released. And part of the reason is Sabbatarianism. These clubs don't actually like the concept of the players. Not only just, they're reluctant to let them leave anyway, let's be honest. They don't want them necessarily going across and playing, for possibly 2 Irelands. But they don't like the idea of them playing on a Sunday. They think it's kind of immoral. Harry Duggan is called up, and depending on what you read...
Well, it's arguable whether they played or not. I mean, Jesus.
Yeah. Harry Duggan is called up, and either he's not released or apparently he was getting a good run in the Leeds first team and he didn't want to play.
So Sunday football was not a feature of football in the UK.
Not extensively.
Not extensively. And the IFA would not play on a Sunday because of the majority Protestant background of those who officiated in the IFA.
Right? Look, we won't come to it because it's an IFA fixture, but the 1958 World Cup, the first World Cup they qualify for, throws up a problem because FIFA, by the 50s, don't really care if you play on a Sunday. And Peter Doherty knows that a couple of his top-class performers, Peter Doherty, who's the great former Man City player and later player manager at Doncaster, fantastic player, one of the greatest inside forwards of the 40s. He's manager of the IFA, the Northern Irish side, and he knows that a couple of his top players who are Presbyterians, they won't play on a Sunday. And he goes and he as a good Catholic, goes and prays that they don't get drawn for a Sunday game. Now he's lucky that they don't, but had a ball been drawn from a bag.
They wouldn't have been able to play.
He would have lost, a couple of his top players.
I was listening to a podcast recently about 1974 in Britain, and the reason why Sunday football was brought in because they got rid of floodlit games, which meant that they had to find daylight hours to play the games, which meant that Sundays were used.
But this is probably
for replays of cup matches and stuff.
We have a huge crowd. We have a huge crowd there early, and it's a Sunday. And of course, like in Ireland, by the 30s, people are well used to Sunday games. People play Gaelic football on a Sunday. It was the day of rest for the agricultural workers. So outside of the cities, it was a good day to play sports as well.
It's a traditional League of Ireland game. I mean, when I started going to League of Ireland games in the early 90s,
it was a Sunday fixture. The Friday night thing is a bit more recent.
It is more recent. Anyway, so we went off on tangent there. Anyway, back to the
but it's relevant, I think.
Back to the hammering then. So,
actually, speaking as we're talking about Jimmy Dunne, we talk about Tom Farquharson. So as we said,
but this is what I want to get back to. This conflict between the IFA and the FAI, and Tom Farquharson in 1931 famously turns down. We mentioned this in the last episode. Turns down an invitation from the IFA to play against Scotland.
Yeah, so they're playing Scotland in Glasgow.
All sorts of shit hits the fan between him and Jimmy Dunne, and there's death threats. And
there's all sorts, absolutely. So we're looking at that team there. We've got 7 players playing the League of Ireland, and here's an interesting one. We have 4 players playing outside the League of Ireland, all playing in Britain, but none in England. Because Tom Farquharson is playing for Cardiff, Harry Chatton is playing for Dumbarton. Paddy Gallagher is playing for Falkirk, and Peter Cavan is playing for Glasgow Celtic. So that's I think that might be unique. Maybe there's another Irish football fan who can see something like that before, where we have
four internationals, none of them English based.
Yeah, but all playing in Britain. That seems unique to me. But as we said, Tom Farquharson rejects this call up, and directly after this game.
Now, Tom Farquharson, just for context, in case if anybody is not familiar,
listen to the previous episodes as well.
Former IRA man, exiled to Wales because of his IRA activity, joins Cardiff, wins an FA Cup with them in 27, is famously responsible for changing the penalty rule where you have to stay in your line for penalty kicks because he's so good at saving them. Used to brandish the odd
pistol every now and
again. But anyway, his republicanism is very, very still important to him, and therefore being called up for an IFA Ireland versus an FAI Ireland is not something that he would not take seriously or have a conscience issue with. So
he has played a number of times for the IFA, but it gets to a point where he just decides, because it's now becoming they're kind of in competition, because the IFA are looking to continually call up the same players who are born outside the 6 counties, and I think it just becomes kind of a breaking point with him. Right,
but the FAI, just to be fair here, the FAI is a team that has emblems that are probably more in keeping with his worldview. So they play the tricolour, they play Aron the Vian.
Yes, or the Soldier Song, as it would have been then.
Soldier Song, right. The diplomats who attend these games are from the Dáil, from the Oireachtas. Okay. The IFA, I'm assuming, would still play God Save the King.
Yeah, he'd be playing most likely in Windsor Park.
And not in front of a nationalist audience necessarily. I wouldn't be as white about that, but
Yeah, it was more of a mixed crowd, but let's be honest, and we'll come to it quite soon. There is sectarian abuse. There is threats. We also know, look, by this stage,
he's from a Scots Presbyterian background, but he was baptised Catholic, but he was right. I think his father was Scots Presbyterian.
But he goes to O'Connell's. He's a friend of Sean Lamass. We know his kind of Republican worldview, and
he's a War of Independence veteran. So this is important in his head. Okay, and he makes this break with him and says, "Right, 931. I've had it. I'm not playing for the IFA anymore."
Yes,
and that is a major break, and it's
a bit of a media coup.
He's called a traitor.
Well, here's the thing: the FAI after this game give him a beautiful illustrated vellum scroll that they frame, and has this beautiful Celtic design on it, and written on it is the following. I'm going to read it verbatim. So it says, Cumann Pella Saoirseád Éireann, the Football Association of the Irish Free State, resolution passed unanimously October 7th, 1931. The Council of the Football Association of the Irish Free State have under consideration the refusal by Mr. Thomas Farquharson, goalkeeper of Cardiff City Football Club, to accept a place offered him on the team selected for the Football Association of Northern Ireland. Noted that they call them the Football Association.
They use that phrase. Yeah.
They don't call them the IFA. They don't call them the Irish Football Association. To play against Scotland on the 19th of September 1931. The council repudiate any suggestion that this has been made that the Football Association of the Irish Free State is not in wholehearted sympathy with the players' action. They take this, their earliest opportunity of placing on record an expression of the sincere gratitude and sense of deep indebtedness to Mr. Farquharson for the inspiring lead that he has given to Irish Free State born players who may be asked to play in teams described as Ireland in inverted commas, but from the selection of which the controlling body of football in the 5/6 of Ireland is excluded. Signed on behalf of the council by Jack A. Ryder, Secretary, on October 1931, and it's presented to him directly after the Spain match.
That is up yours.
It really is. And Farquharson actually said this is more valuable
to the IFA.
It is. And Farquharson is very pleased with this vellum scroll.
Is there a suggestion in there that the FBI were on the back foot and maybe were being accused of not being forthright enough in their thanks to Tom Farquharson? That's what that feels like. It's as if they're trying to repudiate a suggestion that they weren't thankful of his move.
There is a bit of that. I think what comes next is that they were I don't think he ran this by them per se. I think he just decides he rejects the call up by the IFA, and they're kind of on the back foot because they don't expect this. And then other players who are playing in England look to the FAI for guidance, and they don't really know what to say because they're caught in the back foot with this a bit. And I think they're now going on record saying this. And one of the Farquharson himself says this is a bigger honour than winning a cap, and he has a little short quote. He says he would treasure the association's memento, and he hoped that his action upon what was in a way a historic occasion will be followed by other Free State born players who might be called on in similar circumstances in the future.
Right.
Now
it's a call to arms here. It's like if you're from the Free State, don't be going playing for the IFA. Don't be taking their money.
And when he does this, so September, it's only a couple of months prior to this. This is the first match they have after this. The IFA play that game in Ibrox against Scotland, and some of the other players born outside the six counties don't really know what to do. Jimmy Dunn kind of is equivocating. He's kind of feigning an injury. Another former IRA man. He was interned during the Civil War. Harry Duggan kind of again says he's not available because he has a bit of a knock and a bit of an injury. So I think this is the easiest way to get out of it. Because understand they would be
bit of a Roy Keane versus Iran 2001.
And look,
effort there.
And look, we know that like if the clubs are unhappy with you playing on a Sunday, they're probably not going to look kindly on you basically turning down a home nation association to play for the Free State. So Dunn eventually does accept the call up to play for the IFA against Scotland. Now they lose 3-1 in Ibrox, but prior to him going up to Ibrox, I'm just going to read a short excerpt here. When Dunn arrived at Ibrox Park in Glasgow on Saturday afternoon for the international match against Scotland, Dunn, captain of the Irish team, received an anonymous threatening letter. So Jimmy Dunn is captain of the team. He's having a great season for Sheffield United, by the way. I think he scores 41 goals this season, causing a sensation in football circles. It was addressed to Dunn, care of Ibrox Park, and was posted from Belfast. The writer, who was obviously an illiterate person, accused Dunn of being a traitor to his country in playing for a team selected by the IFA and threatened him with death for his action. So this is someone who probably maybe spurred on by Farquharson's decision, feels that Jimmy Dunn should follow suit.
So this is a Belfast, we can only assume, Republican.
Yeah, so it's posted from Belfast.
Offended by the suggestion that Jimmy Dunn, whose IRA background may have been known.
We imagine it might.
We can assume it might be. Is not following the example of
set by Tom Farquharson. At the foot of the letter were the words, "Beware traitor." Dunn was handed the letter by Mr. Charles Watson, Secretary of the IFA, but was not in the least perturbed. He also received at the same time an anonymous telegram from Dublin congratulating him upon his decision to play for his country. It will be recalled that there were reports that Dunn contemplated following the action of Farquharson, the Cardiff City goalkeeper, in refusing to accept his international cap, but later he strongly denied this to the Belfast newsletter. Now, Jimmy Dunn goes and plays in that game. He scores in a 3-1 defeat to Scotland. But it's an interesting one because we'll come to this in the 1939 game.
And we're back in this space again.
His famous Remember 19,
yes,
16 rallying cry. So it just shows the complexity of identity, the fact that the two Irelands are selecting some of the same players, and the horrible situation.
We're back to this stuff. We didn't have to worry about this for a while, but we're back to this kind of the Conor Bradley stuff, and people from the north.
And you would hope that Conor Bradley or anyone else is not going to get death threats from anyone for playing for
whoever they want to play for.
Yeah,
right. But this is the backdrop to this game.
Yeah,
I think every Irish player should get a scroll of sorts when they play for their country.
But it just shows like Ireland at this stage is what we're 8 years on from the end of the Civil War. So we've come out of war. Spain have just come out of a military dictatorship. They don't realise it yet, but they're less than 5 years away from another massive civil war. And just looking.
So what you're saying is that losing 5-0 to Spain is the least of our worries.
Well, little do they know
the most important
storm clouds of war are gathering.
Are gathering. Right.
And we've mentioned like Rocha, who scores two of the goals, will be dead in 5 years' time. Several of the team who we mentioned here. So the goalkeeper who takes over from Zamora after he has the stinker against England is Gregorio Blasco. He's a Bilbao goalkeeper. He wins the Zamora Award 3 times as the best goalkeeper in the league. He ends up because a lot of the Basque players basically go on a tour of France when the war breaks out as a kind of fundraiser for the Basques, and obviously the war continues apace. It's not safe for them to go home, and they go touring Mexico. Blasco ends up living his life.
Which is the kind of a thing that people do. I mean, it's like what Barcelona did during the and as we know, Patrick O'Connell took the team, the Barcelona team, to Mexico during that time to raise funds for the survival of Barcelona Football Club.
So Blasco ends up playing his career out in Argentina and Mexico. One of the players we mentioned there as well,
Ventola.
So Martin Ventola, who's playing for Sevilla. He ends up again going to Mexico as well, and his son, as we mentioned, ends up playing for Mexico in the 1970 World Cup. Jose, yes. So I mean, there's several of these players who
he emigrates to Mexico because of the Civil War.
Yeah. The other guy who scores against us, Luis Reguero, who's playing for Real Madrid, he scores against Italy in the 1934 World Cup. Takes the game to a replay. Eventually, Italy win out 1-0 in the quarterfinals. Reguero ends up in Mexico as well. So you look at this, like some of these players end up dead, some of these players end up in prison, some of these players end up as exiles because of what's going to happen within 5 years.
There is a player called Jose Blanco, right? Or is it Josep Blanco, who is a Barcelona player who does not return to Spain after this trip.
I like the story. I didn't know where you were going with this for a second.
Yes. So Patrick O'Connell takes the Barcelona team during the Civil War over to Mexico and New York to play games, to raise money, earns $12,000, sticks it in the bank account in Paris. This is one of the stories we tell in our football walking tour. And he stays behind in Mexico. And he befriends another Barcelona native who is not a footballer called Ramon Mercader. So we talk about this in our football walking tour. So Josep Blanco is a footballer who is part of that Barcelona team, does not go back to Spain. In fact, only 4 players do go back to Spain because of the Civil War. Right, and he's having coffee one day with a pal of his who is Ramon Mercader, so Josep Blanco is a footballer, Ramon Mercader is from Barcelona, but he's not a footballer. Having coffee in Mexico City, and Ramon says, listen, I have to go off and would you pay the bill? I have to go off and do something. And what he had to do was to stab himself into history by getting an ice pick and killing Leon Trotsky in Mexico City. Isn't that unbelievable?
So tangentially we can bring Mercader to Barcelona, to O'Connell, to Drumcondra,
to Liffey Wanderers FC. There's a link between Liffey Wanderers and the killing of Leon Trotsky. So
it's the 6 degrees of separation, and there's only 4 degrees there. Yeah.
So Jerry, after all that international intrigue, we still have a 5-0 spanking on our hands in December of 1931. Where do we go from here?
Well, you were saying Farquharson doesn't have... apparently it would have been worse without Farquharson. David Babby Byrne basically says, we were lucky we didn't lose 10-0. The aged Paddy Gallagher and Fred Horlicher...
will never play again.
No.
Paddy Gallagher will never play again.
No, Horlicher does. But they end up almost being additional fullbacks. So we're almost playing a back 5 to try and deal with the pace and directness of Spain. So
actually, the next game in the next game against the Netherlands in May of next year, there are 7 new caps.
Yeah, so we
feels like this team is done.
Yes, so we are moving on. And look, some of those players, like even Farquharson himself, is the wrong side of 30. Patsigaller's probably the wrong side of 40.
I don't think he plays again.
I don't think he does. So his Vellum scroll was kind of almost a farewell gift without realising it, yes.
Maybe they wrote it during the game, say we better give him this because he's not going to play again.
And we were saying that Cardiff City were on the decline. They weren't the team that they were finishing runners up in the league or winning the FA Cup. They were on the slide. They were going through financial difficulties. They were getting relegated, a lot of clubs, especially in kind of industrial areas. This is 1931. We're in the middle of the great stock market crash, recession, and things like that. Yeah. We're in the Great Depression. So
the only players who survived into the game of May of the next year are Paddy Byrne, Mick O'Brien, Paddy Moore, and Fred Harker. The rest of them are pretty much dumped.
Yeah. And look, we do have a few others. Saki Glenn's going to come back and things like that. Paddy Moore is unfortunately injured for this game. We miss out on Jimmy Dunn. I even think if we had Dunn and Duggan and Moore, we probably would have still lost to this very good Spanish team.
Okay, right. So there you go. We're into next episode. It's a tumultuous time in Irish politics. There's an election in February of that year, which is the great transfer of power. You have a debate about the entertainment levy, which really brings soccer into the forefront of political debate. You have the Eucharistic Congress, which is basically a flag waving exercise in June of 1932 to tell everybody who's in charge now, baby, which is the Catholic Church in Dublin.
Can I end on a Eucharistic Congress story?
Sure, go for it, yeah.
So,
see it up for next week, which is the Netherlands game in Amsterdam, when we come back to a bit of form and beat them 2-0.
Exactly. So 1931, we know the Eucharistic Congress is coming. It's like hosting
World Cup.
It's like hosting the World Cup. Well, we're going to be hosting the Europa League final soon. Yeah, it's huge. And the Spaniards are good Catholics, and we come to this because this is, the Spanish Republic. It's, we're talking a lot about this tension between the right and left and all this sort of stuff. And it's interesting that there's a big gala dinner afterwards in the Metropole Hotel. People don't know where the Metropole Hotel is. Do you know where Penny's is on O'Connell Street? Yeah. That used to be the Metropole Hotel.
That's where Larkin used to do his speeches.
So there's a big gala dinner there. Everyone's invited. So our friend James McNeil is there. Our other friend
of the pod,
Esmond Grattan, who we mentioned there, who speaks to the guys in fluent Spanish because he's a multilingual, interesting character, to put it mildly. But there is a lot of chat, and the Spaniards, in fairness, they've hammered us, but they also have a great time, and we make a big fuss of them. They're very happy. And it just the manager, Jose Mateos, mentions that our message to the Irish people is preserve in the desire to realise the dream that is in the heart of every Irishman and give expression to their full great traditions, exemplified by the stones in the field of the land and the spirit of its inhabitants. He pointed out the Irish people were in many respects similar to those in the north of Spain, for example in Galicia, where they played pipes similar to those played in Ireland.
We are indistinguishable from people from the north of Spain.
Yes, well, a lot of ginger pale folks as well from that part of the country. Look at Xabi Alonso,
Okay. I'll go with it.
Didn't he go to the Gaeltacht meet or something
like
that?
Yes.
Senior Mateos, manager of the team, returned thanks to the officials of the FAI for the courtesy shown during their stay. And the team was brought with them many souvenirs back to their country, including a number of Eucharistic Congress badges.
Amen.
There was a pleasant meeting at the Shelburne Hotel with the team as they left. And a Spanish exile found himself at home with his kith and kin. He was Reverend Eduardo Gancedo, a Spanish missionary of the Philippine Islands, now staying in Dublin for the purpose of learning English. He spent an hour chatting with his fellow countrymen. They are all Catholics and very good Catholics as well, he told his representative.
Amen. And we will return to that theme in our next episode of Each Game on Its Merits, where we take on the Dutch in Dublin in May of 1932, just after a general election, just before the Eucharistic Congress that you're getting so excited about.
Yes. Who couldn't be excited about the Eucharistic Congress?
We all love a bit of a Eucharistic Congress. Who doesn't? All right, that's it for next week.
So I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Beñat Gutiérrez, who's a football journalist from Bilbao. Welcome to the podcast, Beñat. You're here to talk to us about the pair of games between Ireland and Spain all the way back in 1931. Now, neither you nor I were at those games, but they are very interesting to me from not only a sporting point of view, but from a political point of view. Maybe just for listeners who aren't familiar with what was happening in history in Spanish football and in Spain as a nation in the 20s and 30s. By 1931, there's a lot of political upheaval, but where is Spanish football at this stage? We've mentioned on the podcast that it's on a high point because England have been beaten in 1929. The World Cup is coming up in 1934, but maybe tell us a little bit more about
La Liga and some of the players involved, please.
Yes, of course, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure. It was a very interesting moment for Spanish football in the sense that it was, as you were mentioning, sort of a peak moment, or a moment where football was gaining a lot of popularity. Obviously, there were clubs that were founded at the end of the 19th century, but it's the start of the 20th century and the years going on that create the big mass of Spanish clubs. And it's the decade of the 20s where actually leisure activity sort of popularized. So it's not just an important moment for football, it's an important moment for other sports and also for, let's call it the spectacles like bullfighting or even the cinematography. So it was a moment where people was starting to have some leisure time despite all their big issues, big concerns that were going on the country that we can talk about later. But that possibility of having some leisure time allowed football clubs to raise a bigger fandom, and also through a growing newspaper media, footballers start to be basically something similar to pop icons. We tend to believe that no, it was Galácticos in Real Madrid that created this kind of player, but actually when you look back at that the 20s or the 30s of the 20th century, you find players that had a huge media coverage. Some of them were also playing in these games we're talking about. And it's also interesting because the Spanish competitions, there were a lot of regional competitions. There was the Copa del Rey with different names and denominations that we see how they change on. But it was a struggle to actually create a proper league. It wasn't until 1928 that the first Spanish league is formed. Before there were like two tournaments because there was not a shared idea of what this league should be. So there were bigger clubs that had been more successful in the Copa del Rey, smaller clubs that what they wanted is a bigger league with more teams, while these championing teams wanted the smaller group of teams to play for the league. It's really funny because we're talking about 1928 and we could be talking about the Superliga, the Super League, no? That we speak so much about it in Spain. So it's really interesting that some of the debates we see in current football have been there all the time. It's sort of the clashing pressure that build the sport. But it was that moment of growing, and obviously we know this, that having a competition, a regular competition, helps a lot improving the average level of football in a country, and then that happened in Spain, and that's why some of the players featured in the games were already pretty popular and were already pretty good players.
And looking at those lineups, I mean, a lot of teams we would recognize today are the ones who are dominant. So, I mean, a lot of players from Real Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Bilbao, but then a few other players from smaller clubs. So, El Coyano, which is a team I don't really know. In the game in Dublin, there's a player from Eibhilin, which I think is in the north of the country.
Mm-hmm. So it's in the Basque Country too.
Yeah, so there's a couple of smaller teams represented in those international tournaments as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Alcoyano from Alcoy, it's a club that has not been in the top tiers in the recent decades, but it was really, really popular and was successful. I would say even more than popular in those years. The case of Real Unión of Irún, it's one of the founding teams of the Spanish league. It's a team that is in Irún, in the border with France. Artificial border, non-artificial border, depends how you see it, but it's still a really popular team in the area, and it's currently owned by Unai Emery, the manager of Aston Villa, whose family has been linked to the club for generations with relatives playing in the past and being a big part of his football education. So he's now, through his family, owning the club, and it hasn't been in the second or the first division in a really long time, but it's still one of the classics, I would say, for connoisseurs of the Spanish football. The same with Arenas, here really close in Guecho. that was also one of the founding members. And it's true what you were saying, that at that point there were players coming from clubs that right now, because of the evolution, not just in Spanish football, but in the country itself, they don't have the position they used to have. But it was more common at the time. And at the same time, when we analyze the story of players like Zamora or Samitier, that they left Barcelona for Madrid, it's obviously, it was a thing already, but we cannot look back at the time using the lenses we use now to see the rivalry between Madrid and Barcelona. So it was a very different Spanish football with more options for places that at that point were also more relevant cities.
So we've talked a little bit about that on the podcast, about the profile of some of the players. So Zamora plays in the game in Barcelona. Samitier plays in both matches, and they're both, by the end of their careers, they're both quite very, very famous people, but also quite controversial, because both as players and in Samitier's case as a scout and coach, move back and forth between Madrid and Barcelona. Maybe just tell it, like you mentioned at the start, some of these players were famous to a level that we would recognize now as celebrity. Zamora is one of those players. He's a film star. He's well known on the social circles of Madrid and Barcelona. Maybe just tell us a little bit about those players, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, of course. You mentioned Zamora, one of the best paid players at the time in a situation of growing professionalism. Samitier's case it's a really similar case. Both played together in Barcelona, went to Madrid eventually. Samitier is also a player that I would say in the recent decades, with a whole idealization of FC Barcelona's game, he's been seen as a pioneer of that style of playing. He was called the first magician. And if you look at the articles of the era, you'll see that they were constantly mentioned the way he used the ball, the way he controlled the ball, and how he was doing things that were not that usual on the type of football that was played at the time. That was probably more rustic, no? It was more ABC, and no, you wouldn't get so much trickery or skill. And those were players that they were incredibly popular. I also, and I think it's interesting to talk about a player like Guillermo Gorostiza, because with Guillermo Gorostiza you cover a lot of stories about the evolution of Spanish football and the evolution of Spanish society.
So he's a player who plays for Bilbao. He plays in that 1-1 game.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about him, because he's an athletic club player.
And he's also one of those characters that I guess were also popular on the era. A little bit of a bon vivant, a player that probably wouldn't pass the physical test of the day, at least if he wasn't training properly, and that has this star character to him. He was always up to start a fight with the board. When he was playing in Arenas, in Getxo, he had a fight with the board, and he ended up in Argentina. He went to Buenos Aires to live for a while. Then he's back in the Basque Country. He plays for Athletic. He's part of a very, very successful athletic club of the time. And yeah, he was part of this Spanish national team. But once, and we're covering that short period of the Spanish Second Republic, that is starting when this game happened. Then when he was coming to an end during the Civil War, he joins the Basque national team that went first on a European tour, then went to Latin America. And he's one of the 2 players that actually desert from the Basque national team and joins the area where the Spanish rebels, the far-right national side, or the fascist national side, was. And so, during the rest of the war, he became a propaganda tool, because he was such a popular player. And he was
the last player who sided with Franco and the Phalangist forces.
Yeah, so it was a really, really powerful tool for them to do propaganda. And after the war he's playing, he's also part of Valencia at a very well remembered team for Valencia. I think it was Los Eléctricos, something like that. Like a very kind of electric group of strikers. But he always kept that interest outside of the game, and not in a positive way. So years later, back in the Basque Country, he was just living on really, really poor conditions, and he was featured even on a documentary called Juguetes Rotos, where they were just checking the lives of past stars of music, of arts, of sports, and how they were doing at the time. And I just saw the images, and I was like, oh my God, it was quite shocking. But it was more shocking when I checked the age he had at the time. He was less than 60 when he died. And it was kind of, he was completely wasted. And he had this kind of crazy life. He was used by the Francoist side as a propaganda tool. And at the end of his life, he was just a name on the old sports articles, on the old football game recaps. And it's kind of terrible. And obviously, he's not, as he took that side, he's not going to be the player that athletic supporters are going to bring immediately. Obviously, people who saw him play say he was great, but he's not going to become the kind of hero that other players are.
And I suppose what was happening at the time, because we'll come on to it now, but what about regional identity? Obviously, you've mentioned there that when Franco comes to power, that a Basque team goes on tour to France and then to Central America and South America, and a lot of those players end up staying and living in Mexico. We might come on to that. We've mentioned a few of them in previous podcasts. People like Luis Reguero and others, Ventrola, whose son ends up playing for Mexico.
Yeah.
But people will be familiar now that maybe Athletic Club is very much identified with the Basque region. Only select players who have connections to the Basque region are from the area. How strong was regional identity then, and how much of a part of it was played? Because we know that jumping forward a few years in history, the Spanish Civil War was a horrible conflict, but it was especially vicious towards the Basque country, and people probably are familiar with the bombing of Guernica and things like that.
They were, and I think it's one of the defining features of that time. There were tensions also in Basque nationalism, as there were tensions in the Spanish Republic, and there were basically tensions everywhere. It was a moment where many ideologies were shaping. We need to think that the modern form of Basque nationalism at that point was still pretty recent. Sabino Arana, like the founder of the Basque National Party, and one of the key people, or the key person to shape that ideology at the time, passed early on the 20th century. There was also a very ingrained Catholicism in Basque nationalism, which at that point, as you can imagine, was also starting to show some cracks from groups that were maybe separating more from the religious part of it. And we had that in the 20s, and you'll see that even at the life and death of sports newspapers here in Bilbao, for example, the tensions inside the nationalist movement that made some fame and others grow. And it is true that there was a sense of growing identity. There was a sense of pride, obviously, that had been before. There were growing results for, as I was saying, the Basque, there was a growing sense for the Basque National Party once then elections were able to happen properly. And the identity was really strong, which didn't necessarily mean, and maybe I'm just stepping on historians' part of this, didn't necessarily mean that it was like the verge of independence. It's really interesting, though, because all these tensions about how to give the place they deserve to regional identities, mostly in Catalonia and the Basque Country, that was leading factor of internal disputes during the Spanish Second Republic. Even between those that were in favor of the Republic, that wasn't that clear. And actually, on that game in Barcelona, with the Republican leader Alcaraz Zamora and the Catalan leader Francesc Macià, that happened just shortly after Macià had proclaimed the Catalan state inside the Spanish Republic. And those were factors of tension all the time. And you see, even if it was short history for the Spanish Republic, you see changes about how to do it. You see some autonomy statutes for the regions, back and forth. It was something very present, but probably at the same time very different from the way we perceive it today.
That's interesting, because we've mentioned on the podcast there's this huge political display and athletic display before that game in Barcelona. And Zamora, the president, is there. But that's fascinating that they're announcing almost an autonomous Catalan state within the Second Republic. And just for listeners, we're talking about the proclamation of the Second Republic in 1931. The Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1939, and effectively the Republic kind of ends, you could say, in 1939 with Franco's victory. So it is very short-lived, as you say. One thing I wanted to mention as well, a lot of the clubs we know today have the prefix Real because of royal patronage. The man who leaves before, at the dawning of the Second Republic, is King Alfonso XIII, who is a big football fan, if I'm right in saying, and he gives a lot of, like, Real Sociedad get their Real from him, as do Madrid and others.
And it's interesting you mention it, because if I can bring current affairs, moment, we're recording just after the Copa del Rey final, because the name Del Rey, King's Cup, came back years later, and there's always this big thing when Basque or Catalan teams are involved about booing the anthem. Not actually booing, but whistling, because it's Spanish culturally. You don't boo, you do like the whistling to the anthem. Well, I can say to disrespect it, yeah. And before the game, Athletic Club issued a statement telling fans not to do this, not to disrespect the Spanish national anthem, and that went into a big Twitter controversy, as you can imagine. And then rest of the fans will jump in, be like, "Oh yeah, they're telling you not to do it." And then Athletic fans will respond and be like, "Yeah, and you keep Real on your name." No, so even to the day, this thing of clubs being called Real Mallorca, for example, that was playing the final too, it's a big thing. And it's interesting also that you mentioned that, how the name Real became so popular in Spanish football, because then with the ascent of the Second Republic, those team names were changed. And Real Madrid, for example, was Madrid Club de Fútbol. But what happened after, during the Francoist year, is that the teams that lost the Real during the Republic were able to recover it, but Anglo names were forbidden. That's why Athletic Club became Atlético de Bilbao. So it's really interesting how the names were changing all the time during that those political changes, and changing along with it.
And of course, I mean, Athletic Madrid were a sister club of like players from Bilbao. That's why the red and white stripes. And then under Franco for a while there, Atletico Aviación. So they're always Air Force.
Yeah, it was really a constant changes, and that's why it's really interesting to look into deep on these topics, because with the years past, it became really popular, this idea, for example, that Madrid was the regime's team, Barcelona wasn't, when actually all clubs were regime's clubs because the regime had the power to control one way or another all the clubs. And if you were allowed to be president of one of these very, very relevant institutions for society, is because, maybe they were not controlling you, but at least they were giving you the green light.
And I suppose that's being an athletic club fan. In the 1950s is a period of great success for the club. And I think it's interesting that if maybe the European Cup had started a year or two earlier, or if things had gone differently, that great athletic team with Telmo Zarra and things like that, they could have become the face of the regime. Franco famously said that Real Madrid were great ambassadors for Spain, but that's because they had a great team at that time. And I think, as you say, people look back and think, oh, they were a great Francoist team because of someone like Santiago Bernabeu being in charge and him famously being very pro-Franco and a friend of Franco's. But as you say, the president of Barcelona was someone who was put in by the regime, and he was someone who was a loyal Francoist as well. So the idea that one is pro-Franco and one is anti-Franco is very simplistic.
Yeah, because all were developing under the excruciating power of the Francoism, and obviously there were different eras, but mostly at the start it was just fascist dictatorship. And I know it's really kind of seductive, this idea that Barcelona, for example, or even applied to Athletic or Real Sociedad, were fighting for the rights of the people. Maybe their fans, and not maybe, like actually their fans were able to express more things in the football field than in other spaces, but it was all really, really controlled. And the few times that things went a little bit out of the control, it was made clear that that wasn't allowed.
I like that idea though, because it's talked about a lot, and people talk about Camp Nou as a site of protest, like the football stadium as a safer space to protest and be critical of the regime, because you're there in thousands rather than in the middle of the street or something like that. That it was maybe one of the few places in Spain under the dictatorship where you could be critical of the regime.
Well, if I can drop another just fun fact, just slightly related with all this. I don't know if you've seen that in Spanish games. When you see the referee names, they will show you both family names. Here we have two family names. We get our fathers, we get our mothers. So you have a name, and then you get your both families. But actually, when you talk about the popular person, you say the name, the first family name. That's it. But with referees, you don't refer to the name, but to the two family names, and that's because there was a referee whose name was Ángel Franco. So to prevent people to just insult Franco through, no, we're just insulting the referee. No, Franco is whatever. And it's like, no, we're talking about the referee. What they did is start referring to the referees with the two names. So it was Ángel Franco Martínez, was called Franco Martínez. That way they could avoid the criticism to Franco in the stadium with the excuse of bad refereeing.
That's fascinating. One thing we touched on earlier, I would like to come back to it, is the Basque team that goes to France, fundraises for the Basque resistance cause, and then ends up going to Central and South America. And we've also talked on the podcast before about an Irishman who was involved in some of this with Barcelona, Patrick O'Connell, who was the manager of Barcelona and also brought them on that tour to the United States, to Mexico. And many of the players remained in Mexico, as was the case with a lot of the Basque players. They stayed and developed careers there. And as we mentioned, Van Torla's son becomes a Mexican international 30 years later. Can you talk a little bit about some of that, if that's okay?
Yeah, of course. It's still really relevant to the day. When Basque fans think about the idea of having an official national team, the idea that comes to their mind is the international tour of this group of players that were very successful, were very talented, and they got really good results during that tour. Basically, this happened in the context of the Civil War, on a context where it was starting to be really difficult to the Basque government and to keep funding the war effort. And at the same time, I think to understand this, it's important to point out how for the Basques, the civil war was slightly different than maybe in other points of the on the Spanish territory, because yeah, they were fighting for, many of them, they were fighting for the Republic, but they were fighting for the Republic as a medium to reach independence, or at least an autonomous status inside the country. And as I was also mentioning before, Catholicism was such an important part of our society at the time, which led to some different dynamics, because some elements of the Spanish Republic were really anti-clerical. So there were cases of people prosecuted by one side for being Catholic and prosecuted by the other for speaking Basque, for being Basque. And that whole created also a need to, meanwhile the war was going, do stuff to preserve that distinctive Basque identity. So in this context is when the classic charity games we see in all conflicts in the world, and we keep seeing every time there's a disaster, an undesirable situation in the world stage, it started being a more humble thing, small games. There were actually even games between political parties, like representing, just kind of get some distraction for people that was in a quite stressful situation, and at the same time raise some money. And they decided to just take one more step and take the team to foreign countries with two intentions: raise money for the war effort, and also raise sympathies for the Basque cause and for the Republican cause. And that's how recruiting the core of athletic players of the era, but also players from Real or Real Union, they just started the European tour, and it was the natural step to take it to Latin America because of the tradition of Basque presence in the region, and how it was becoming one of the safe spots for Basque people to start a new life when just they could not face more the war situation that the country was living. So it felt really natural. It was popular. The results were very good. And as you were mentioning, some players stayed there. Some players just because they had connections. You're mentioning Bentalra, who's Catalan, but his situation is similar. He goes on the tour with Barcelona that Barcelona was doing to raise money, and then apparently he falls in love. So what more do you need in life, not to stay in a place? And what happened with these players is that some of them stay there. And if you look at the Mexican Championship of those during war, post-war times, you see clubs like Asturias, where I think Reguero ended playing, or even the Euskadi that did very well with Basque foreign players, because Spanish communities in the country were just building around football clubs and staying there in Mexico, where they still, in the case of Basques, they still have quite an impact in business or even in sports, like Javier Aguirre, El Vasco Aguirre, the Basque, something called like that. And
and like we've mentioned a few of those players, the Basque players, like Gregorio Blasco, who's the goalkeeper, who ends up playing in Mexico and Argentina as well. And interesting you say about the Basque relationship with Catholicism, because I know from my own research that obviously here in Ireland, all the media coverage of the war at the time was very much framed as Franco was fighting a war to protect Christianity and Catholicism. And this was countered by some of the more left-wing groups in Irish society, and they brought over Basque priests to actually speak at public lecture tours to talk about what was happening and the aerial bombings of Basque cities, the horrors of the Franco war machine, the involvement of people like the armies of Italy and Nazi Germany and things like that. And this kind of began to maybe change a little bit the perception in Ireland of what was happening in Spain, to the point that while I don't think it would be right to say that Ireland suddenly became more sympathetic to the Republican cause, I think that it did kind of maybe change the view some people had of the likes of the International Brigades and the Blue Shirt, which was the Irish kind of fascist group who went out to fight with Franco. And that when they kind of came home, they weren't treated as heroes, where they had been, blessed by the bishops and cheered from the docks when they went out to fight for Franco. And I think a lot of that was down to maybe the work of Basque activists and Basque clerics as well in Ireland to change that perception a bit. Which is
there's so many layers, and obviously there were some core elements of Basque identity at the time that were in between, I will say, the main topics that were leading the war.
And I just, maybe before we finish up, Beñat, is there anything just from these two games that you think is remarkable or interesting? Because I just think the characters are so big. Players like Zamora and Simicher, who are still huge icons for their clubs. A player like Arocha, who scores in both games, who's killed during the war. Several of the players who've become kind of exiles in Mexico and Argentina and places. There's such interesting stories. But anything else that jumped out to you as something interesting or different or unique?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, when the first game happens, it was so close from this proclamation of the Republic that it was also a really adequate moment to push an idea of a new Spain and the values that were going to lead the country. And obviously, newspapers are always hyperbolic, but I think they were more in the past if you look back. And I was taking some newspapers of that time, Basque sports newspapers and some Catalan newspapers, and I found really interesting in La Rambla how they give news of this game, and they headline citizenship and sport, and how they will saying, going beyond the actual result of the game, that an sporting people, it's a people that is aware of their rights and obligations. Just kind of putting out there what should be the civic duties of citizens in this new republic, and I think it's very interesting how also they mention that politicians in the game were enthusiastically received. Maybe pointing out more outside of the game, but just thinking about the politics and what meant at the time for Spain, having a national team playing in Barcelona in a moment where there were many different paths that politics could take.
And it's interesting. It's sad, I suppose, that in 1936, Barcelona was organizing the People's Olympics as a kind of a counterpoint to the Nazi Olympics in 1936 in Berlin, which is obviously famous because of Hitler storming out of the one football match he went to and Jesse Owens' famous victories and so on. But that obviously the People's Olympiad never happened because the war breaks out. But it's just that it's in connection that you're talking about there, that connection between civic duty and civic responsibility and sporting pedigree and sporting behavior and things like that.
Yeah, there was that connection, and interestingly also, I think, because sports is such a powerful tool and has such a capacity to get deep into our hearts. Unfortunately, it's been misused so many times, and it's been used to mislead people into buying things that they shouldn't. And actually, this is not something of the past. This is something that happens today and keeps going. And you just need to take a look at any sports, from football to cycling. You see who's funding big why they're funding clubs, and it gets quite sad to think about it. But we still love it.
Yes, I know this is the problem. Our love for the sport gets manipulated by some of these big corporations and people and states and things like that. Just one last thing, I suppose, I'm interested to see if you, from reading some of those old newspapers, what the view was of the Irish team, especially that game in Barcelona. That apparently, reading the match reports, Ireland played quite well. We get a good draw. The goalkeeper saves a penalty. Was there any comment on the Irish team or the style of play?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was reading from Excelsior, that was at the time a sports newspaper in Bilbao, and they saw that the Irish were completely overwhelmed by the speed and collocation of the Spanish rivals, and they really give a lot of praise to Blasco as a goalkeeper, but there are also Irish players mentioned, and they mention Gallagher just as a player that plays in Scotland in a first division team, and that he was saying he was the player where all the hopes of the Irish team were put during the game. But I like how it's very vague. He's in Ireland, in a team, in Scotland, in a team in the first division.
He would have been a very high profile player, but many years ago. So he was, depending on whose age you believe, he was either 37 or 40 in that game. He had been a great player for Glasgow Celtic, but he was kind of past it. And I think we think he was just beat Macy. He was played because he was a famous older player and he would get fans.
The only one that gets mentioned in the article.
Yeah, it's a pity because, one of our favorite players is the goalkeeper Tom Farquharson, who had been a rebel in the 1920s and had to flee the country, not unlike several of the Spanish players would have to do in a few years' time. And he goes and lives in Wales, and he becomes this famous goalkeeper and wins the FA Cup and things like that. But yeah, unfortunately, there was a lot of expectation put on Gallagher, but I think he was a great player in his youth, but his best days were behind him.
Yeah. Though that's one of my favorite things in football, and we don't see it that much. The player that is past his prime, but still holds the hopes and dreams of everyone. I guess the sports is even more mean these days, or it's meaner these days. But that's a great story when you look back, and that's film material. When you see this player that is chubby, is probably drinking, but still has it, maybe some sparks during a 19-minute game.
He scores a famous goal in the 1925 Scottish Cup final for Celtic, where he dribbles between 6 players and then beats the goalkeeper. The goalkeeper falls at his feet, and he's only a little guy. He's only about 5'6", but he has the ball between his feet and he somersaults over the goalkeeper into the goal. And it's still, they call it the Gallagher Cup final, and it's still, apparently there's no film of this goal, but it was so astonishing that every newspaper reporter was like, this is the greatest goal that has ever been scored. No player has ever decided to somersault into the ball between his feet. And he became so super famous, and he had won 7 league titles with Celtic in Scotland by this stage, but he's an old guy, and I think he retires like a year later. So unfortunately we never got to see the best of Pat Gallagher.
Yeah, that's also a good one, no? The time that we could not see the prime of anyone. We just read about it, and it's kind of romantic. It's kind of nice.
Yeah, you have to take people's stories and articles at their face value.
Yeah.
And as you say, most of the media is full of hyperbole anyway.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I guess if we knew that people wouldn't check, we'll be the same hyperbolic at this point. Because I don't think you cannot talk about what's happening on the pitch, on the court, on the road, without being hyperbolic. Because if not, it's pretty banal. If you don't just dress it with a lot of meaning, it's just people doing a physical activity. You need to put something there. You need to give it the meaning and the value.
And this is what I hope we're trying to do with this podcast is not just do a match report, but to talk about who the people were, what was happening in the world, what was happening in their lives, and give it a little bit more depth.
Yeah, and I'm really enjoying it. You have now a fan from now.
That's great. And one thing I just do want to mention is that the first team that Basque selection played again after the death of Franco, amazingly, is a League of Ireland selection in 1979.
Yeah, it's really interesting because Until I got interested in just reaching to find more information, I will just think they played Ireland. And if you ask people today, people that was in the game, they'll tell you they went to the game against Ireland.
And it was marketed as Ireland, but it was
exactly.
League of Ireland.
So it's kind of no, it wasn't actually, and they're like, no, you're fooling me. So it's really that's also it's great because we mentioned the national team that went on tour in Latin America, and talking about the team that played against the League of Ireland team, you have probably the biggest moments in the history of the Basque national team. The ones that help people to dream about what would be to have a national team playing officially games. Those are the ideas we go back constantly when trying to project the idea of an official Basque team, and those can really mean a lot for Basque supporters and for the idea of Basque team.
And people who don't know, the Basque selection won 4-1 in that game, but a very young Ronnie Whelan, just before he moved to Liverpool, scored the League of Ireland's only goal. I think he was only 17 or 18 in that game. And obviously it's strange that 5 years later he was winning a European Cup with Liverpool.
Yeah, and obviously football culture was different at the time. It was harder to follow international tournaments, but I'm sure there was people that years later we like, oh my God, I was so lucky to see this player in San Mamés.
Well, look, it's been fantastic talking to you, Beñat, and I appreciate you coming on and talking to us like literally the morning after Athletic Club have won the cup for the first time in 40 years.
Yeah.
And congratulations on that. It's great to see, and it's such a unique club with such an interesting history.
Yeah, the vibe in the city is crazy. I'm really glad to be able to share a little bit of it, and it's gonna be almost a full week of celebrations. During the week, you'll get to see the amazing images of the boat going through the river in Bilbao with all the players, closing a historical wound. I can tell you that there were fans already thinking about how to sink the boat if Athletic wasn't winning, because he was at this like one of those courses like Billy the Goat or whatever like that. But I guess the boat is gonna have a second life, at least for other 40 years. It's gonna be crazy. I was honestly surprised yesterday when I was going back from work. The amount of people with jerseys, the amount of people just carrying, the big groups of people, and you'll imagine that they were all, going maybe to San Mamés where the game was shown in big screens, but they were going everywhere. Those people going everywhere, but everywhere going to watch the game. And I watched the game with the window open, and the city sounded like a stadium. It was a really intense experience.
And look, it's on my bucket list. San Mamés is a stadium I have to visit, I think, before.
You'll be welcome, and we can have some pinchos before and after.
Well, that's the plan. The pincho on the football. That's a great selling point for the city.